I know exactly what you felt when you read that title. It's an image that simply doesn't add up, is it? German prisoners of war, the same soldiers of the Nazi regime, in American camps with ice cream and Coca Cola. It almost seems like a joke, a distortion of the brutal reality we imagine of World War II. You've spent your entire life hearing about Stalingrad, about D-Day, about the hunger and suffering. And suddenly this seemingly trivial information emerges, but it shakes your entire understanding of the conflict. It's a dissonance that disturbs, making you question what else you don't know about the reality of that time. You're probably tired of the same stories told over and over again, focused only on the battles and famous generals. What you seek is what's behind the scenes, the human stories, the logistics, the engineering of war that goes beyond tanks and planes. You miss content that explores the nuances, the gray areas, the moments that define the psychological and industrial aspects of the conflict. Frustration comes from finding only superficial facts, when what you really want is a deep analysis of how things really worked, how culture and production shaped the final outcome. Imagine for a moment that you are Hans, a young Wehrmacht soldier, captured in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, after months of eating moldy bread and thin broth. He has been taught his entire life that Americans are decadent, weak, and an impure society on the verge of collapse. He is transported across the ocean on a ship whose construction speed was already a weapon of war, and arrives at a camp in Texas or Alabama. He expects brutality, starvation, and forced labor like those his regime inflicted on others. Instead, on his first day in the camp canteen, he can use the small pay he receives for his work to buy a cold bottle of Coca Cola. Here, we promise just that. The full story behind this disconcerting image. This video isn't about a curious anecdote. It's about the United States' greatest secret weapon in World War II, its overwhelming industrial capacity, and the logistics that transformed consumer goods into tools of psychological warfare. We'll delve deep into the regulations of the Geneva Convention, the reality of prisoner of war camps in the U.S., and the profound cultural and ideological shock this abundance caused in the minds of German soldiers. Prepare to understand how ice cream was a symbol more powerful than many bombs. If you're fascinated by the behind-the-scenes and logistical engineering of World War II, this is your channel. Sign up now to never miss any in-depth analysis of the innovations that changed the world. Click the button and join our community of military history enthusiasts. August 1944, a dock in Norfolk, Virginia. The air is heavy, humid, and warm, a far cry from the autumn that was beginning to take hold in the France he had just left. Klaus, a 19-year-old Luftwaffe radio operator, steps down the gangplank of the transport ship. His eyes are hollow from the exhaustion and hunger of the last months of fighting in Normandy. He and hundreds of other men in faded gray uniforms are greeted not by pointed bayonets, but by American soldiers who look incredibly tall, well-fed, and relaxed, chewing gum as if it were the most ordinary day in the world. Their first stop is a processing area where they are searched, disinfected with DDT powder, logistical innovation in itself, and given new prisoner uniforms emblazoned with the letters P-double. They are still enemy soldiers on enemy soil, waiting for the moment when the facade of civility will fall. They are herded onto a passenger train, not a cattle car like the ones that transported prisoners in Europe. The windows are open, and the train begins moving into the vast American continent, a continent untouched by war. It's on this train that the first real shock occurs, the first blow to the ideological armor Goebbels built. American guards pass through the corridor distributing K-rations, but also something more. They offer cartons of cold milk and white bread and cheese sandwiches. For Klaus, who hadn't seen white bread in 3 years and whose cheese at the front was rancid paste, this was an otherworldly luxury. A guard, seeing his hesitation, opens a dark glass bottle with red lettering and hands it to him. The drink is sweet, bubbly, and cold. It's his first Coca Cola, and it tastes like utter defeat. To understand how this was possible, we must first look at the state of Germany during the same period. In 1944, the German war economy was in its final stages. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was pulverizing industrial centers, synthetic oil refineries, and transportation networks. For the German soldier at the front and the civilian at home, shortages were a daily reality. Bread was spread with sawdust, coffee was made from roasted barley, and meat was a distant memory. Nazi propaganda blamed the Jews and the Bolsheviks, but the reality was logistical collapse. The captured soldiers arriving in the U.S. came directly from this environment of extreme deprivation. Many were underweight, suffering from malnutrition and diseases related to poor hygiene. They were indoctrinated to believe that Germany was the most advanced and powerful nation in the world, and that the United States was a decadent, racially impure, and industrially weak society held together only by propaganda. They expected to find an America suffering from similar or worse shortages, especially with a war on two fronts. What they found was the arsenal of democracy in full operation. The United States, protected by two oceans, wasn't having its factories bombed. Its agriculture wasn't being destroyed by tanks. On the contrary, the American economy was overheating, producing ships, planes, tanks, and food on a scale the world had never seen. American industrial capacity was fueling not only its own armed forces, but also those of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. When the first shiploads of German and Italian prisoners of war began arriving in 1942 and 1943, the United States faced a logistical and moral dilemma. The country decided to strictly adhere to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which regulated the treatment of prisoners of war. This decision was not purely altruistic. The U.S. had tens of thousands of its own men, especially airmen, in German prison camps, and any harsh treatment of Germans in the U.S. could result in brutal retaliation against Americans in Europe. The Geneva Convention was surprisingly specific. It dictated that prisoners of war should be housed in conditions similar to those of the depot troops of the captor army. More importantly, it stipulated that the daily ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops. For American depot troops, this meant a dietary standard that was, by world standards, incredibly luxurious. It meant regular meat, fresh vegetables, dairy products, and sugar. More than 400,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States and housed in more than 500 camps scattered throughout the country, many of them in remote locations in the South and Southwest, such as Texas, Arizona, and Oklahoma. These camps needed to be built and managed, but they also offered a solution to another American wartime problem: the labor shortage. With millions of American men serving overseas, the country's farms, lumber mills, and canneries were desperate for workers. German prisoners of war became this labor force. Under the Geneva Convention, they could be compelled to work in non-military tasks. They picked cotton in Mississippi, cut sugar cane in Louisiana, picked tomatoes in California, and worked in canneries in Wisconsin. This labor was not free. The convention stipulated that they should be paid for their work. The pay was symbolic, usually 80 cents a day, paid not in U.S. dollars but in scrip or canteen coupons. This is where Coca Cola and ice cream come into play. The scrip could only be spent in the camp canteens, known as post exchanges or PXs. These canteens were supplied by the U.S. Army logistics system. They sold prisoners the same luxuries that were available to American guards. These included cigarettes, which were incredibly cheap and plentiful, candy, razors, soap, magazines, and, of course, cold bottles of Coca Cola. This abundance was simply a byproduct of the standard logistics system. Coca Cola itself was a phenomenon of logistical engineering. The company had promised that every American soldier overseas could buy a Coca Cola for 5 cents, no matter where he was. This led to the construction of mobile bottling plants that followed the Allied armies across Europe and the Pacific. Supplying the syrup to prison camps in the U.S. was a trivial task in comparison. For the Germans, the drink became a liquid symbol of American industrial prowess. They simply couldn't understand how a nation at war could waste so much sugar and transportation capacity on a frivolous beverage. Ice cream has a similar history. Ice cream was considered essential for the morale of American troops. The U.S. Navy went so far as to commission ice cream barges, essentially floating ice cream factories, that could produce hundreds of gallons per hour to supply warships in the Pacific. The Army had portable ice cream machines. In prison camp canteens, ice cream was a common item, often produced locally or supplied by nearby dairies with government contracts. The scale of this logistical operation is difficult to comprehend. If you find this analysis of war logistics fascinating, please like the video. It helps us know that you enjoy this kind of content focused on systems, not just battles. The ability to feed house and employ nearly 500,000 enemy troops in the midst of a global war while simultaneously supplying battlefronts thousands of miles away is perhaps the greatest demonstration of engineering prowess of the 20th century. The psychological impact of this abundance on German prisoners cannot be underestimated. They have been told for years that they were starving and fighting for a just cause against a decadent world. Now, as prisoners, they often ate better than they ever had as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. They gained weight, their health problems improved, and their minds began to question the Nazi narrative. How could a decadent nation produce such a surplus? Joseph Goebbels, the master of Nazi propaganda, was aware of this danger. Letters sent by prisoners back to Germany, describing the food and treatment, were so unbelievable to starving German civilians that Goebbels launched a counter-propaganda campaign. He claimed the Americans were forcing the prisoners to write these letters to break German morale, that it was all a cynical lie. The truth, however, was more powerful than any lie he could invent. Beyond food, there was a re-education program. The United States saw the capture of these men as an opportunity. They wanted to denazify the prisoners and turn them into seeds for a future democratic Germany. The camps offered courses ranging from basic English to university-level classes in agriculture, engineering, and American democracy. They published camp newspapers, such as Der Ruf, The Call, which promoted democratic ideals. But the most effective re-education tool wasn't in the classrooms. It was on the menu. It was the soft white bread, the abundance of meat, the fresh milk, and the bottles of Coca Cola in the cafeteria. This was tangible propaganda, something they could taste. It was the daily refutation of the ideology that told them the American system was broken. The American system was so wealthy that it could afford to treat its captured enemies better than the Third Reich treated its own elite soldiers. This isn't to say that life in the camps was a holiday. It was still captivity. There were barbed wire fences, guard towers, excruciating boredom, and constant anxiety about the fate of their families in bombed-out Germany. There were deep political divisions within the camps, with fanatical Nazis often intimidating or even murdering prisoners they considered traitors for cooperating or expressing doubts about the ultimate victory. The work was also hard. Picking cotton under the Texas sun or cutting oak in the Wisconsin cold wasn't easy. There were occasional strikes, escape attempts, though rare and usually unsuccessful, given the vast ocean separating them from home, and moments of tension with American guards. However, the systemic violence, deliberate starvation, and dehumanization that characterized German prison camps, especially on the Eastern Front, were completely absent. The experience of German prisoners in the U.S. contrasts horribly with Germany's treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Viewed as subhuman Slavs and Bolsheviks, Soviet prisoners were deliberately starved to death by the millions. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured, more than 3.3 million died in German captivity. This was a policy of extermination by neglect, a weapon of war based on ideological and racial hatred. In contrast, the mortality rate in German prison camps in the U.S. was incredibly low, mostly from workplace accidents or natural causes. This disparity wasn't just about morality. It was about capacity. The U.S. could afford to feed its prisoners. Germany, in its final years, could barely feed its own people. American logistics and industrial production were decisive weapons that crushed Nazi ideology. The POW labor program was a resounding success for the American war economy. In 1944, POWs contributed millions of hours of labor, saving crops that would otherwise have rotted in the fields. They cut timber essential to the war effort and worked in canneries that shipped food to soldiers overseas. They became a vital, if reluctant, cog in the very war machine that had defeated their nation. Interaction with American civilians also had an impact. In many rural areas, POWs were the only link locals had with the enemy. American farmers, initially suspicious, often came to respect the German work ethic. The prisoners, in turn, saw firsthand the casual prosperity of small American towns, the private cars, the well-kept homes, and the stores stocked with goods. It was a world Nazi propaganda told them did not exist. It's amazing to think that a menu could be a psychological weapon, isn't it? The abundance was a living refutation of Nazi ideology. What do you think was the biggest shock to these prisoners, the Coca Cola, the food, or the humane treatment? Leave your opinion in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives on these human aspects of war. As the war in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, the atmosphere in the camps changed. The news of Germany's unconditional surrender was a devastating, though expected, blow. What followed was true horror. Americans began showing films in the camps. Mandatory documentaries depicting what Allied troops encountered when they liberated concentration camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. For many of the German prisoners, this was the final collapse of their world. Some dismissed it as American propaganda, a rehash of the atrocity stories of World War I. But for most, the graphic and undeniable images of piles of bodies, skeletal survivors, and gas chambers were shocking proof of the monstrosity of the regime they had fought for. The abundance of Coca Cola now seemed insignificant compared to the depth of this moral depravity. The war was over, but the captivity was not. Europe was in ruins, and the logistics of repatriating hundreds of thousands of men were complex. Furthermore, the U.S. still needed its labor force for the 1945 harvest. The German prisoners remained in the United States for months, some until mid-1946, working in American fields while their own families starved in occupied and divided Germany. The return home was the reverse shock. These men, now healthy, well-fed, and often dressed in surplus American civilian clothing, landed in cities like Hamburg and Bremerhaven, which had been reduced to mountains of rubble. They found their families living in basements, suffering from hunger and cold. They, the defeated, were in better physical condition than the victorious civilians who had survived the collapse of the Reich. The legacy of this experience is complex and lasting. Thousands of these former POWs developed a positive view of the United States. They had witnessed the productive capacity, efficiency, and overall decency of the American people. When the Cold War began, these men became a vital bridge between West Germany and the United States. They had tasted Coca Cola and knew that the American system, despite its flaws, offered prosperity in a way that neither Nazism nor communism could. The story of German POWs in the U.S. is ultimately a story of logistics as a weapon. German engineering produced Tiger tanks and V-2 rockets, technologically brilliant weapons, but produced on a small scale and logistically unsustainable. American engineering produced the Liberty ship, the Jeep, K-rations, and the Coca-Cola bottling machine, mass-produced innovations that won the war through attrition and overwhelming abundance. The ice cream and Coca-Cola weren't an act of kindness. They were an inevitable byproduct of an industrial and logistical system so vast and efficient it could wage a global war and still have enough surplus to treat its enemies to a level of comfort they'd never known at home. It was the ultimate demonstration of American power, a lesson taught not with candy, but with sugar and carbonation. World War II was won as much on the assembly lines of Detroit and the cornfields of Iowa as it was on the beaches of Normandy. The ability to design, build, and maintain a global supply chain that could feed armies, allies, and even prisoners of war was the greatest engineering innovation of the conflict. Nazi Germany never stood a chance against an enemy that could turn ice cream into a tool of state policy. This story reminds us that war isn't just about tactics and strategy, but also about economics, industry, and the ability to sustain human effort. The casual abundance of American prison camps was a microcosm of what made the Allied victory inevitable. What did you think of this perspective on war logistics? Are there other soft innovations like this that you'd like us to explore? Leave your final thoughts in the comments and share this video so more people understand the power of production.